Hey, what is up guys? This is Larry at The Financial Lift, and today I want to do another video about giving some career advice, and what better place to start than giving the worst possible advice, or at least the worst possible advice I've ever heard as far as your career. I also thought it'd be pretty funny to just share those stories as far as those people you hear that just give these advice that you're just kind of wondering, what are they thinking? So feel free to comment down below any funny stories you have related to just really poor career advice. And I should say that some of the worst career advice I'm going to share in this video are not necessarily completely crazy ideas. I mean, some of them in very specific situations, they are applicable and they do make sense. So don't necessarily get too offended if you feel like, hey, that advice worked for me, so it's not necessarily the worst career advice. So to start with some of the worst career advice, the first being, you should put up with a job you absolutely hate because every job out there is just absolutely terrible. Wait a minute, this advice actually sounds really accurate. Okay, unless you're working a job as a toy tester, or perhaps you work for Food Network and you get to travel the world tasting food, there are certainly going to be aspects of your job that aren't necessarily that great. Even if you ended up getting your absolute dream job, there may be certain aspects that are outside of that job that kind of make it worse. For example, you could have a really terrible boss. Unless if your boss is Michael Scott, then there's probably a good chance that you don't always see 100% eye to eye with your boss. I find that there's a lot of people out there that end up putting up with a job that isn't necessarily a great fit for them, simply because they're very convinced that there's going to be bad aspects about different jobs. And that may certainly be true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't find a different job that is a better fit for you. I kind of think of it in this terms of like a balanced approach. Same thing with the boss. You may not necessarily get along with your boss 100% of the time, but at least you see eye to eye enough that you're able to get things done. I kind of view it the same way as a best friend or significant other. At the end of the day, you don't have to 100% agree on the same restaurant, but it really is important that you both show up to the same restaurant. You can't necessarily just say, I'm out of this friendship altogether, I'm gonna go eat by myself. Well, I suppose you could, but then you would end up with no friends like me. Okay, jokes aside, the way that I like to frame this advice is the job you're at, are the good aspects outweighing the bad aspects of your job? This allows for the advice to be a little bit more actionable. So if it turns out that the bad aspects of the job really do outweigh the good aspects of the job, then you end up deciding whether you should leave that company or not. Or perhaps there are things you can do to actually make the good outweigh the bad. Perhaps it's asking for a raise, or perhaps it's asking for a better work structure, like working from home, or whatever it ends up being that ends up having that good aspects of those jobs outweigh the bad. Speaking of which, I have a whole playlist I'll link down below as far as career advice and how to negotiate a better salary that I'll link down below if you're interested in that. Moving on to the second bit of bad advice I always hear, which is to not necessarily accept a pay raise or to not necessarily work a second job because you're going to end up getting taxed more. Now, this only applies to if you live in a country that has a progressive tax system like the US, but it's a common misunderstanding that the more you make, the entire amount that you make ends up getting taxed more. To simplify, let's say all your income from $0 to $20,000 is taxed at 10%. When people say if you make more than $20,000, you will get taxed at 20%, that doesn't mean that if you make $20,000 and one extra dollar you get taxed, all of that gets taxed at 20%. It means that every $1 above $20,000 is taxed at the 20%. So in this case, you pay 20 cents on that one extra dollar, and then everything else, so the first $20,000 is still taxed at that 10%. So this is where people end up getting confused and talk about you shouldn't necessarily take that slight raise because you could end up being pushed into that next tax bracket and end up actually making less than before, even though you ended up getting a raise. Or some people will end up recommending doing things like donating money to fall back below that tax bracket, but that's not how it works. See, I think where the confusion happens is if you make, let's say, $40,000, and these are just examples here, the first $20,000 is taxed at 10%, the second $20,000 you make is taxed at 20%. Then on average, your tax rate would end up being 15%. But if you made, so then people look at that and think that all of their money is taxed at 15% versus that it's separated into two different groups. But if you made that $20,000 and one extra dollar above $20,000, that first $20,000 is still taxed at 10%. That one additional dollar does not make your whole entire salary get taxed at 15%. That $1 is taxed at 20%. Then your average or effective tax rate ends up being something like 10.0 0.0000001%. So it ends up not really having a big impact. But hey, if you're really opposed to making more money, go ahead and send that money my way. Just kidding. You obviously earned that money. But if you don't mind hitting that like button for me, hopefully I earned that. Now, the next poor career advice I always hear, which is actually two different phrases that I'm going to lump into one topic, which is to work your way up the corporate ladder and stay as long as possible. And the second be, do anything to get your foot into the door of a company you want to work for. Now, before I get a lot of hate for attacking these two bits of career advice I commonly hear, I'm not necessarily saying that these two tips are always the worst things to do. What I think ends up happening more often than not is that people use these two bits of advices, but don't end up having a plan, a long-term plan on how they're going to kind of navigate that. How are you going to work up the corporate ladder? Or how are you going to yes, you can get your foot in the door at the company, but do you have a plan to get to the position that you're actually looking for? Let's say I want to be the head of marketing for like a company like Target. Well, I could work as a cashier at Target, or perhaps I could go work in some marketing department for this small no-name company. And unfortunately, what I see happen a lot is that people will go work as a cashier at Target in hopes that they can eventually work their way up to that marketing position. But sometimes it actually works heavily against them. And I've actually witnessed these conversations firsthand where people will talk about, hey, should we promote this cashier to, some kind of executive program or something like that? And people will kind of talk about and say, well, this guy's been a cashier here for 2 or 3 years. Yes, that kind of shows company loyalty, but does that also kind of raise red flags? Why has he been a cashier for 3 years when he's in his 30s? Maybe there's a reason. Maybe he's a poor worker. And so they end up passing off on that person and then rather hire someone, an outside hire, because they don't have that inherent bias. Ironically, it's kind of one of those cases where it's like we want experience, but we're not necessarily going to give experience. And it's the same thing here. We want company loyalty, but if you're so loyal to us that you've been here 10 years and never got a promotion, then we're not necessarily going to throw you a bone either, because it's kind of weird that you've never gotten promoted for 10 years. So sure, you could stay at a company for, a number of years in hopes that you're going to move up the corporate ladder, and that can actually happen, but I always recommend that a better and more effective approach is job hopping, which I did a whole separate video on that, and a lot of people even commented on there how they were able to boost their salary by tens of thousands of dollars by job hopping, which is just where you go from one company to another and kind of, pin these two companies against each other. And in some cases, you can even come back to the original company and make a much higher salary, even for the same position. And that's why you commonly find people working the same job, but yet one person makes, $10,000 more. That's because they came from an outside company and they were willing to negotiate. Now, I also want to talk about this idea of staying at a company very long so you can move up the corporate ladder. I think a thing that people don't necessarily think through is if you hate the company you're working for, or if you hate your particular line of work, let's say you're working in the accounting department at the very bottom end, and you're thinking, well, I'm going to stay at this company for a few years so I can work my way up to head accountant or, the head of the company, but it's not a company you believe in, then all that's really going to happen is you're going to end up hating your job even more and more. You're going to have to commit more and more time to that position because obviously it's going to come with more responsibilities. So if you hate your job now, you're probably going to only hate it more. And then it's only going to be that much harder to leave that job because chances are you're getting paid a lot more and you're relying on that money. You're kind of getting more used to that lifestyle with that money. So then that decision of, do I leave this company and forego that huge salary because I hate it, makes it that much tougher. And then next thing you know, you're 60 years old, retiring from a company you hate. Now, on the flip end, I always hear this worst career advice as far as follow your dreams and don't necessarily worry about the money. Well, two problems with that. One, I always dream about money. That's my main dream. And secondly, my other dream is me being a superhero, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. Okay, obviously I'm joking about all that, but I do think it's absolutely true that some people just end up following their dreams, but not necessarily thinking things through. Sure, it sounds great to be a travel blogger and travel the world, but how is that going to fit into your dreams and plans of having a family of 5? Are you going to take them along with you? That doesn't necessarily seem like it's going to work out. You see, you really don't want to put yourself in a tough position that could have easily been avoided. For example, working at a job that's really fun for 10 years but doesn't necessarily pay too well, so you're not able to save a lot of money, only to happen, 10 years down the road, you want to have a more stable job, you want to have a large family, or you do have a few kids already, and then in that case, it's really tough to end up accumulating savings, and it's really hard to find a better paying job because you've been working at this fun job for 10 years. So from the company's perspective, why would they hire you when when they have other people the same age or even younger that have more actual professional experience. But maybe all of this could have easily been avoided because at the beginning there was two jobs that you actually liked equally, one having more long-term opportunities and the other not having those opportunities, or one paid more versus the other. And if you like both of them equally, then obviously money should be a factor. It doesn't necessarily have to dictate your life, but you shouldn't just follow your dreams and then just neglect money. I think you can kind of have a healthy balance to both. At the end of the day, some sacrifices have to be made for long-term opportunities, and for better or worse, that's just kind of the world we live in. You don't really have control over that, but what you do have control over is those trade-offs, those different trade-offs I was talking about. If you like a job a little bit more than the other, but it pays significantly less, then perhaps you go with this other job that you still do like, but it pays significantly more, so that way you have better long-term opportunities. Or even just having some kind of plan in place as far as you recognize that this is a fun job that you're going to work for a few years, but it doesn't have any long-term career opportunities. Maybe there's some skill sets that you can start building on the side, so that way you are in a position in the long term to kind of pivot and change your career altogether. Now, to move into kind of the fun part of this video and just some of the funny stories I've heard as far as the worst career advice, and these are things I've either seen firsthand or have even experienced myself. The first being, in college, I always see with career counselors or job coaches or whatever that career counseling department ends up calling themselves, to not apply for a particular job because they're convinced that you're not necessarily going to get qualified for it, or that's not worth your time to apply to. Now, aside from the fact that the people that are, there to basically help guide you in the next stages of your life are also sometimes the people that are kind of putting you down or not building up your confidence. Besides that humorous and ironic fact, I also think it's just kind of like, why not? Especially in college, most people have a lot of time. This isn't necessarily, you're in your 30s or 40s and you have 5 kids. So every time you apply for a job, you're wasting time for jobs that you aren't qualified for. In college, you usually have plenty of time, whether you believe it or not. So then it's actually worth it to you to apply to jobs that are a little bit out of your reach, because if there is a chance that you end up getting a call back, then great for you. That's the best case scenario. You get a job that is a little bit outside of your qualifications. Worst case scenario, you don't hear back from them and you wasted 5-10 minutes of your day. I also think this is kind of common practice with like temp agencies or job hunters, people like that, because they ended up kind of knowing like, well, I have 3 candidates. I want this candidate to qualify for this job, this candidate to qualify for this one. But if, candidate A ends up kind of throwing off that plan because he applied for a job I told him not to, and he ends up getting, then this other candidate B doesn't have a place to go. So I think that's kind of, a little bit of a malicious reason why sometimes that advice is given. So I definitely recommend if someone tells you not to apply for something because you aren't qualified, I kind of just say, why not? Unless if it's a scenario where you're going to apply for other positions at that company, then there's pretty much no reason why you shouldn't apply to a job that's a little bit outside of your qualifications. The second funny bit of career advice that I always hear is you'll never make it in this industry. And sometimes you even hear that from people within the same company. They're telling a peer that, you should give up while you can. This job clearly isn't for you. I'm not really sure why that's the approach that some people take. I kind of think it's a little bit for malicious reasons, but at the end of the day, it's like, why shouldn't that person be trying to help guide your success? Why aren't they trying to give you better information so that way you are set up for success for that position? I think this also translates into those settings where it's like, well, a woman couldn't do this job, or a woman isn't really fit for this industry and they're not going to make it in this industry. Those are the types of mentalities that I kind of think, at the end of the day, if you yourself believe in yourself and that's something you want to pursue, that's all that really matters. It really shouldn't matter to anybody else's business whether or not the industry is right for you. If you believe it is, and that's right. So last bit of funny worst career advice story that I have for you, which is just kind of a couple of different scenarios, but it's just that whole idea of people giving career advice in a field that they have no expertise in. So you commonly find this with, like, the best example would be like professors and teachers that are, perhaps they're an engineering professor. And it certainly is true that there are professors that they were an engineer at one point and now they just decided to teach. But there are a lot of professors out there that they just finished their doctorates, and all they know is just the kind of academic perspective, and they're trying to give you advice on how to get, the best engineering jobs. And, that kind of falls flat because at the end of the day, I personally believe that Good advice is not a trade-off for good experience. At the end of the day, there's a lot of things that work in practice, but when it actually comes to real day-to-day life, there's a lot of things that end up not working out perfectly. And having that insight is invaluable. So when you can talk to somebody who actually works in the engineering field or works in whatever field you're actually interested in, and they can give you some recommendations, that's going to do you a lot better than a person who has no insight into that. And same thing's kind of true with like job coaches or career counselors. It's not like they've worked every single job out there. They'll give you recommendations. They can even have you take surveys and tests, but at the end of the day, they may not necessarily have the same insight as somebody actually in that field. So that's kind of what I would recommend for most people, is to go directly to the source of people that you're kind of interested in working with, ask them questions, and then you can make a decision on what career advice actually works for you. So that's it for this video. If you appreciate this video at all, please give it a big thumbs up. And like I said, if you have any of your own funny kind of worst career advice stories you want to share, feel free to comment down below. And if you like business, personal finance, or anything like that, or career advice, those are videos I really like creating. So please consider hitting that subscribe button. I hope to see you in the next one.